Hello, my name is Gopala K. Vasudevan. Today I'd like to do a review for the final exam. Uh, so the format is going to be a little bit different from the previous two exams. You will have 7 problems and each problem would be worth approximately 14 points. Some of them could be a little bit more, some of them could be a little bit less. Okay. Just like the exam one, you can bring in a one-page formula sheet. Please make sure you don't have any numerical examples. You can bring down all the formulas you need. You can write down all the steps you need. And, anyway, you don't need it now. You don't have any definitions. Okay, please make sure you don't bring any definitions. What time and date? It's on Friday, December 16th. December 16th. And it's at Barakis Health Science Center, room 310, between 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. Okay? Room 310 and 3:30 to 5:30 p.m. So what are the chapters? Chapter 6, which is making capital investment decisions. Chapter 16, valuation and capital budgeting for the levered firm. Chapter 21, leasing. Chapter 22-23, options in corporate finance. Chapter 29, mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures. And Chapter 31, international corporate finance. So these are the chapters. Uh, so what did we do in chapter 6? So we talked about finding out the cash flows for a project and finding the NPV, internal rate of return. Once you figure out the cash flows, you will get at least one problem. So again, just like I told you before, you can certainly write down all the steps you need to figure out the cash flows from the operating cash flows, how you go to the cash flows, uh, figuring out the salvage value, and finally figuring out the NPV or the internal rate of return. Now that is something you covered in the previous exam, and definitely you want to go back and make sure you review the material. So you will get at least one problem from here. The next topic was chapter 16, and we talked about capital structure. So there were two theorems for the Modigliani and Miller. So the first one said that without taxes and bankruptcy costs, capital structure is irrelevant. With taxes, 100% debt is correct. And when you have both taxes and bankruptcy cost, you might choose somewhere in the middle. And we also talked about the effect, what happens to the required return on common stock as we increase the leverage. So here, RS is given by the return on unlevered plus B by SL. So B is the value of debt divided by the value of levered equity times R0 minus RB. So R0 is the return on unlevered equity and RB is the cost of debt. So that would be one way to find out the cost of equity once you have leverage. And we also said the value of the levered firm, so the firm with debt is equal to the value of the unlevered firm plus B times the PC. So B is the amount of debt issued and PC stands for the tax rate. Chapter 22 and chapter 23, they talked about options and corporate finance. And that would be a very important chapter as far as the exam is concerned. So we talked about uh, so we talked about uh, the call option payoff. So what do you get when you buy a call option? We also talked about what you get when you buy a put option, the payoffs. Okay, so those are you know basic things we talked about. We also talked about the payoff maximum of 0 and the difference between the stock price and the strike price. And in the case of put option, that would be maximum of 0, the difference between the strike price and the stock price. So that would be the payoff for the call and the put. It's very important to make sure you're comfortable with these formulas. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is because when you do the problems and so on, you have to know it very comfortably. Otherwise, it's very difficult to do uh, the binomial model or anything like that. So this is the payoff for the call. And when you look at the put, that is given by maximum of 0 and K minus S, okay, minus P. Okay, so typically what that means is that when you try to exercise a call option, there are two things you do. Whenever the stock price is higher than the strike price, you will exercise it. If it is not higher, you just walk away. And in the case of the put option, you want to compare the difference between the strike price and the stock price. And whenever the strike price is higher than the stock price, you will exercise it. Otherwise, you walk away. And perhaps, one of the most important concepts we talked about was the put call parity. And what is the put call parity? Basically, what it tells you is that when you buy a stock, and when you buy a put, that is the same as having the present value of the strike price in the bank plus having the call price. So that is one way to look at that. What are some of the other definitions? So some of the other definitions are when you talk about put call parity, okay, basically here it tells us that stock plus put is equal to bond plus call. Now there's a very high chance you might get one problem from here. So the question would be, you are given three of the variables. So for example, you are given the stock and you're given the put price. You also know the strike price of the option. You're asked to find out the price of the call option. So that is one example. As long as you are given one of the three variables, all the three variables, you could always figure out the fourth variable. We also talked about binomial options, so that would be a very important material as far as the exam is concerned. What are some of the things we talked about? We talked about finding the hedge ratio of call options and put options. We talked about finding the risk neutral probability. And finally, we talked about finding call and put prices. So there's a very high chance you get maybe at least one question from here. So what are things we talked about as far as the binomial model is concerned? I think the most important thing would be finding the delta of the option. And what is the delta of the option? The delta of the option tells you by how much the option moves for a given change in the stock price. So as an example, you plug in the numbers and you find the delta is 0.5. It tells you that when the stock price moves by $1, your option price moves by 50 cents. Okay, that's an example. And the other definition of that is it also tells you how many shares you have to sell to hedge one put option, or how many shares you have to buy to hedge one call option. The next thing we talked about was finding out the risk neutral probability. And what is the risk neutral probability? So the risk neutral probability basically tells you, uh, that is something like the probability you find. But the main difference here is that we are basically finding this based upon risk neutral valuation. So what that means is that we are trying to figure out, compare two portfolios. One is the call and the other would be a synthetic call. And that basically you can buy a certain amount of shares, and to finance the purchase, you can borrow money. It doesn't really matter as far as how they come up with that, but you want to make sure that you are, able to comfortably use these formulas. So here, P, the risk neutral probability, is given by e raised to RT minus D divided by U minus D. So here, either you can use the e raised to x function in your calculator, or E is given by 2.718. R is the risk-free rate. T is the time to expiration. Sorry, T is the time for each step. Now, what is D and U? So basically here, what we are saying is that, as an example, let's say that the stock price is, okay, so here, let's say the stock price today is uh, $30. In 3 months, it can go to 36 or 30. So in this case, 36 over 30 is 1.2. That stands for U. And let's say it should be 27. Okay. 27 is the price at the bottom, and 27 by 30. So 27 by 30 equals zero point 0.9, and that stands for D. So here U is 1.2 and D is 0.9. And once we have that, we can find out the risk neutral probability, and that is given by e raised to RT minus D divided by U minus D. Okay, so typically if it's a 12-point question or a 14-point question, the first thing you would be asked to do is find out the risk neutral probability. And once we have the risk neutral probability, I think it's pretty straightforward to find out the call price or the put price. And what is the call price? So the call price is given by P times CU. So the probability of it going up based upon the risk neutral probability times the how much the call is worth at the top plus 1 minus P, the probability of it going down times the value of the call at the bottom divided by 1 plus R. So 1 plus R tells you we are trying to find out the present value. And one thing again you want to be careful about is that uh, perhaps you want to use 1 plus R raised to T. Okay. So 1 plus R raised to T because T stands for the time period. So if each step is, let's say 3 months, T would be 3 by 12 and so on. Okay. And maybe the question might also ask you, once you know the call price, to find out the put price and so on. So this would be, I think, one of the most important chapters as far as the exam is concerned. And to reiterate, I think the main things we talked about was to put call parity. Okay. We talked about finding the risk neutral probability, and then based upon that, finding the put price or the call price. So all these are definitely, very important material as far as the exam is concerned. Okay. Now, chapter 21, that talked about leasing, and basically it talked about the different types of leases. And as far as this exam is concerned, is understand how to apply NPV to the lease versus buy decision. And we also talked a little bit about understanding the importance of tax rates in determining the benefits of leasing. And what will be the type of problem you can expect? Find the net advantage leasing. So when you talk about the lease to versus minus the buy decision, how you can figure out the cash flows, and then you can find out the present values of the cash flows. And we also finding out the cash flows for lease payments and for purchasing. So here, I think the main thing you see is that when you talk about a lease payment, usually it means that, let's say it's a 4-year lease, you make the same lease payment. Let's say it's $500 every year for the 4 years. Now, what is the cost of the lease? The cost of the lease every month, every year would be the $500 you paid times 1 minus the tax rate, because you get a tax benefit, you get a tax break on the lease payments. Now, what about the purchase decision? So typically the purchase decision is in the first year, you have to pay for the equipment. So that would be like $20,000 or $25,000 you pay for the equipment. And after that, every year, uh, what happens is that you can depreciate the asset. So that would be a benefit as far as you are concerned. And the depreciation times the tax rate, that tells you the tax benefits of the purchase. And typically, you want to compare these two things. Okay? Mergers and acquisitions, that will be chapter 30. We talked about valuing a target company. Okay? So typically what that means is that you want to figure out what are the cash flows of the target. Typically you might have to find out a terminal value and then figuring out the present value of the cash flows. Now to find the present value of the cash flows, you need an interest rate, and usually the interest rate you want to use, that would be the cost of capital for the target company. Now, what is this valuing the synergy? So the synergy from the acquisition would be the expected cash flows, the present value of the cash flows minus the price paid. We also talked about finding the amount of shares that to be paid for a stock acquisition. So chances are, perhaps you can get one problem from here. Chances are, that could be from valuing the target company and figuring out the price you have to pay if you want to pay with stock. Okay. The last chapter we talked about in the last class was on international corporate finance. We spent, I think, 2 classes for that. So it's going to be an important chapter as far as the exam is concerned. And what are the main things we talked about? Initially, we talked about the different types of interest rates, exchange rates. We talked about the direct exchange rate. So the direct tells you the price of 1 unit of the foreign currency. We talked about the indirect exchange rate. That would be how many units of the foreign currency you get for 1 US dollar. And the third was we talked about the cross exchange rate. And what is the cross exchange rate? So that would be the exchange rate between, let's say, the euro and the Japanese yen, okay, or the British pound and the euro. So in both these cases, the exchange rate we quote is independent of the dollar. Now, we also talked about interest rate parity. Now, what is interest rate parity? That's a very important concept as far as this exam is concerned. So that tells you the relationship between the forward price and the spot price. And what it tells you is that the forward price is given by the current spot price. So today's spot price times 1 plus the interest rate in the US divided by 1 plus the interest rate in the foreign country raised to t. Okay, I wrote it down a little bit different, but this is what we are saying here. And what it really tells you is that the forward price is given by the future value of the spot price. And what is the interest rate we are using? The interest rate we are using is 1 plus the interest rate in the US divided by 1 plus the interest rate in the foreign country. Now, we also talked about covered interest arbitrage. Now, when is covered interest arbitrage possible? So covered interest arbitrage is typically possible when the forward price is greater than what the formula tells us. So if the forward contracts are overvalued, you might have an opportunity to do covered interest arbitrage. So here, that takes place only when the forward price is greater than the spot price times the formula. So how do we do that? At time t equals 0, what we are doing is that we know that the forward contracts are overvalued, so you want to sell the forward contract. You convert into foreign currency, so that could be Canadian dollars or any other currency, and you invest at the risk-free rate in foreign currency. Okay, so whatever is the risk-free rate of the foreign country, we're going to invest at the time. And what do we do at the end of the year or at the end of the time period? So you have a certain amount invested in the bank. So the amount invested in the bank, you basically that you want to find out the future value. So that would be the amount deposited times 1 plus the risk-free rate in the foreign country raised to t. And the amount you have, you can convert it back into US dollars. So this way, if you take the future value multiplied by the forward price, that gives you the amount in US dollars. So the question might be, what is the profit from arbitrage? Okay, so in the case of the profit from arbitrage, what we are saying is that maybe we started with $100,000, you ended up with uh, maybe 105,000. So the 5% is the return you get from arbitrage. Now, if you have, you could compare that with the risk-free rate because that is, all the things you did are based upon the uh, fact that those are riskless, all the processes. So given that, let's say you make 5% and the risk-free rate is 3%, you made an extra 2% without taking any risk. Okay. What about the other last thing? We talked about international capital budgeting. And I think, we talked about two ways you can find out, NPV. So the first one is you can figure out the future cash flows in foreign currency. And then what you can do is for each foreign cash flow, you can convert it back into US dollars. And typically the interest rate you want to use, the exchange rate you want to use is the forward rate for that time period. And we can find the forward rate using the interest rate parity. So once you have the cash flows in US dollars, it becomes pretty much a US capital budgeting. So exactly what you studied in the previous chapter. So that's pretty straightforward. Although, it's straightforward, I'd suggest that you go with the second method. And what is the second method? Find the cost of capital in foreign currency. And how do you find out the cost of capital in foreign currency? So this is the formula. So 1 plus the weighted average cost of capital. So 1 plus the weighted average cost of capital in foreign currency is equal to 1 plus the weighted average cost of capital in the US times 1 plus the risk-free rate in the foreign country divided by 1 plus the risk-free rate in the US. So as an example, if the interest rate is 6% in US and 2% in, uh, let's say, Canada, okay, what we are saying here is that the cost of capital in Canada would be roughly 4% higher, would be 4% lower than the cost of capital in the US. The formula gives you a more strict way to find the cost of capital, but roughly we are saying that interest rates are 4% lower in Canada and the cost of capital in Canada would be 4% lower. Now, once you have the cost of capital in the foreign country, you can use that to find out the NPV in the foreign currency. And finally, you can convert the NPV into US dollars at the spot rate. So all said and done, this is a little bit easier to do. And the reason why we want to say that it's a little bit easier is because you only have to worry about finding one cost of capital, and then you convert at the spot exchange rate. So the main thing here is that you don't have to worry about finding 3 or 4 or maybe even more forward rights. Okay. So as I told you before, these are perhaps the most important things as far as the exam is concerned. So I think I posted a set of sample questions on Blackboard, on Connect. I will add a few more questions. If I cannot find them on Connect, I'll post them on Blackboard. So that would be the first place, definitely you want to take a look at if you are preparing for the exam. Chances are, there are 7 problems you can expect, and maybe around 5 would come from those sample problems I'm going to post, and 2, they could be coming from outside. Now, what are the most important chapters? I definitely state that the most important chapters I perceive are chapter on options. So we talked about the binomial model, we talked about the put call parity, and the second most important chapter I'd say would be the international capital budgeting. So 3 to 4 problems you can expect from these 2 chapters. The other questions, maybe one each from all the chapters we covered. Okay. Uh, so uh, do take a look at that. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. You could email me, and I'll also, announce the